Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema, exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came unto the darkly splendid abodes. Welcome to another Deep Dip, where we will be exploring a particular book more fully. This time we'll examine a chapter from 8 lectures on yoga, a book by Aleister Crowley compiled from a series of lectures he gave in 1937 Era Vulgaris. The book is divided into 2 sections, Yoga for Yahoos and Yoga for Yellow Bellies. We'll be looking at Lecture 4 of the first part, which focuses on the practices of Asana and Pranayama. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
All right, today we are talking about yoga.
The 4th lecture from Yoga for Yahoos. What am I doing? What is that radio voice I'm using? By
coming in at number
Crowley.
4.
Are these transcriptions of real lectures he gave? Because
It's a
his
good question.
irreverence, it's so scripted.
I know. There's like the one point where he's like, in a civilized country such as this, and then in brackets, uproarious laughter or something like that. It's like, okay, I get what you're doing there, but I doubt that actually happened.
I'm trying to imagine who would give a lecture like this. There are comedians who are this spontaneous and this literate. There's a guy from Newfoundland whose name I don't remember, but he tells these long stories that are stacked up in this kind of like deep way with, many beautiful syllables. And people used to be able to orate like this in a way they can't now, even in the 70s. Like Daddy Trudeau was much more eloquent than our degraded Trudeau that we have now. So it's possible. It's tough to imagine someone giving a lecture on a technical subject like this, and then spontaneously coming out with so many of these nuanced turns of phrase, unless he had written it and memorized it and performed it like a play. But that seems like the wrong way to teach a class on a technical subject.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was a process of just transcribing it and then editing it after the fact. But so we were talking about 8 lectures on yoga by Aleister Crowley, and specifically, as you mentioned, the 4th lecture in Yoga for Yahoos. It's a 2-part book with Yoga for Yahoos and Yoga for Hippies, was it?
Yellow bellies.
Yellow bellies. Those of the bellies yellow.
Speaking of slurs we didn't realize were racial, when you're talking off mic about being surprised by times when, hey, that colloquial turn of phrase, it turns out that's racist.
Growing up in the 90s, you had no idea about these things.
And it's not racist that I was shocked by heebie-jeebies. That is not...
Gives me the heebie-jeebies?
Heebie-jeebies. I spent a lot of time looking this up, and it is not anti-Jewish in any way.
Oh, thank God.
So you can still say heebie-jeebies. You probably can't sing that Louis Armstrong heebie-jeebies because that would be a different kind of cultural appropriation. but you can still get freaked out by stuff and be really cute.
Wow, that really gives me, yeah. But we're starting with Yahoos.
Which I think is fine.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the term Yahoo goes, the only thing we'd be running into is the fact that probably nobody ever uses that as a term for a foolish person anymore. It's just purely a search engine.
Did he invent is this the first time this shows up in popular culture? Because there's that whole religion for dummies books, architecture for
Oh, I
dummies
see what
books.
you're saying.
Is this
the first
genesis
for
of
dummies?
that?
Good question.
I think in the 14th century, one of those Chinese philosophers did something about battle for cowards. But in English, I think this is the first one.
We have lectures 1, 2, and 3 ahead of this one, which we are not covering at the moment, but maybe we'll sort of reference or whatever if need be.
So the most important things in the previous lectures are yama and niyama. Yama is things not to do, and niyama is things to do. And Crowley sort of tries to hand-wave a lot of this as being empty moralism or religious moralism. And so yama is, for him, don't do things that interfere with your yoga practice. Don't get too excited and too stressed out. Try to keep a focused, relaxed, disciplined existence, or rather an existence that is appropriate to the cultivation of self-discipline. And niyama for him means find your true will, do it, and do nothing else. So this is in the beginning of this lecture when he says, last week we were able to go away feeling we had broken the back of the job. We had got rid of bad ways, bad wives, and bad weather, and are comfortably installed in the sunshine with no one to bother us, having nothing to do but our work. This is what he means, is we've all learned our true will and eliminated inconvenient distractions.
So it does seem like things extraneous to the actual work proper.
Yes. And the reason it takes 3 lectures to do that is that traditionally yamas are incredibly prescriptive. It's like, you shouldn't drink because it's evil. You shouldn't kill people because it's evil. Don't receive gifts is a weird, because it's evil. Mm-hmm. Don't borrow money because it's evil. And the point is that these things aren't evil. They just tend to inhibit one's ability to practice. Mm-hmm. And he'll say that explicitly in this lecture as well, in a more truncated form. But if you want to kind of get that out of the way, that's our starting place. That's why we can be comfortably installed in the sun, because we sort of know what life we need to leave, and because we've abandoned the idea of moralism that goes with that. So we don't feel like guilty about trespasses. We just know we need to sit down and get to work.
Yeah, it's a nice setup to things, really. So it's definitely worthwhile, even with that sort of summary. It kind of sets you up for the idea that we're taking more of a essentially scientific approach, really, or a objective approach to it. Mm-hmm. So we're not getting caught up in the morality of things. That doesn't mean that we're completely amoral. It means that morals don't really come into it.
Yeah.
What is the subject of this 4th lecture?
Asana and Pranayama. Asana means, at least in one of Crowley's definitions, whatever is comfortable and easy. So you sit still comfortably and easily for a long time. In this lecture, he'll say that it actually means control of all the physical forces, control and restraint. So you bring all of the physical forces down to the most simple possible rhythm, so that you aren't distracted by the physical body. And pranayama means control of energies or something. There are lots of different energies in the body. According to Hindu philosophy, the most important ones, Crowley says, are the Ida and the Pingala, which are the channels, the lunar channel that comes up and down kind of the left side of the body, behind the lung and beside the spine, and the Pingala, the solar channel, that's on the right-hand side of the body. Between these is a Sushumna, which is a channel that isn't usually used, but the reason it's there is to take Kundalini from the base of the spine up into the brain. One of the ways to unlock this is by doing pranayama, Nadhi Shodhana pranayama, which is the alternate nostril breathing that Crowley recommends. usually pranayama is control of the breath, but here we mean something more like control of the subtle energies. And again, Crowley will say most of these are not important. What's important is to figure out how to settle into your practice. You regularize your breathing. So by regularizing your posture, you minimize physical distractions. And then by regularizing your breathing, you sort of start to organize the physiology on a subtler plane, your respiratory system, your cardiac system. And this, in turn, continues to settle the brain so that you can work. Thank you very much. That's been our show for today.
Yeah,
I overdid it, Darren.
No, that's all good. Now we all know the history of yoga. It's made up of the words prana and yama, which is probably painfully obvious, but at the same time, it's kind of handy. I always like to break the words down themselves because you get yama again from the first couple of chapters.
Oh, that's right. Not to do. Mm-hmm. So, or
control,
or to
at least
control, to restrain, to organize.
And prana
energy.
Being that energy, and that's actually, maybe that makes it easier to get at the term prana and why it's different from breath control per se.
I think prana does mean breath. I don't think there's another word for.
Now, is it breath in the same
breathing.
sense as like spirit comes from the word for breath as much as it alludes to what we think of as spirit and that sort of thing, and ruach and pneuma.
Yeah, the way we're taught it in Thelema is that these are kind of interchangeable concepts,
or
right?
Connected
and that,
in some way.
That God breathes into man's nostrils to sort of insert the soul. So breath is tied to spirit. That breath and spirit are the same thing, and so I don't know for sure, but I do think that in the Sanskrit language, prana means breath, actual breath, but it also refers to the energy, the subtle energy that's controlled when we control our breath. So my understanding is that those actually are interrelated, not interrelated concepts, but adjacent similar concepts. I don't want to say one thing is related, is in a genealogical relationship to the other thing, but that they both exist as similar ideas.
They're both in the same universe.
Holy Christ. This is going to be fun for you today.
Oh, edit.
I am on fire.
I'll just slap it all on the raw.
Just cut all my parts and just to use yours.
Just me repeating the good parts of what you said.
Yeah, and then just
sounding like I know what I'm talking about.
I think we can disclose a little bit, because one of our unspoken rules for these conversations, or undisclosed rules, is that we didn't want to sort of approach the text as experts. We wanted to sort of just do like a deep reading of what's in front of us, to show that that's possible and helpful and interesting, because so many people who are doing secondary literature on Thelema are approaching it as experts and kind of giving you things that distract from the core texts. But this is one where, I think that the text itself is pretty simple, and the deep reads would actually be more helpful in understanding the jokes than in understanding the text. The text, the instructions are fairly basic. So I think if we're going to get a real conversation out of this, it might be helpful to disclose some of our experience with doing
and I
these
think
exercises.
That's actually one of the nice things about this subject matter as well, is because I don't find that people tend to talk about their personal experiences with such exercises as this. They tend to just tell you what you're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to get out of it, if they even touch on what you're supposed to get out of it. A lot of the time it just seems like they just say, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and moving on. A really interesting way that Crowley talks about this process, as you mentioned, is relating it to rhythm. which is a really interesting way of thinking about it, a really helpful way of thinking about it, especially coming from a background of music, for sure, but I mean, we're not really talking about musical rhythm per se. What we're talking about, as Crowley says at one point, for instance, we're stilling the body as much as we possibly can, and then we're stilling by making the breath rhythmic. And we're kind of slowing it down and doing these things to it. And we're not actually doing anything of the sort of stopping the breath, but we're tricking ourselves, in a sense, into thinking we have by means of that rhythm.
That's right. It's interesting to realize that how dynamic relaxation is. That we think of just like laying there and doing nothing. And there's these progressive relaxation exercises you can do where you start with the scalp and then try to relax the brow and try to relax the cheekbones. And I don't know what other people's experience is, but I just feel the stress kind of moving through my body. The amount of focus that's required to release the muscles in my forehead, for example.
Yeah.
Using that focus adds tension somewhere else in the system. And so the idea of relaxation as simplifying movement instead of stillness, because like you can't stop your heart or whatever.
Yeah.
And when you do, you have rigor mortis and then some other process of tension and relaxation. The body goes into shock, and there's a post-death stress that
yeah, it's a process.
Stuff.
Death is a process.
Yeah,
it's not like a single incident.
So yeah, allowing for the possibility of relaxation in movement is kind of a profound thing to think about when you're working with like figuring out how your weight works and where your body is and stuff.
And it's also nice because the idea of thinking of it in terms of rhythm is nice because it gives you some context for thinking about some of the other subject matter here in terms of what our goals are with yoga, like escaping from the constant suffering that life imposes upon us. So like, for instance, he talks about like once at a certain point with your asana practice, when you really lock into it, you have a freedom from pain that is profound, and you suddenly realize that you've been suffering constantly throughout life. And I think there's a truth to that. I think that's why people fall into habits of using alcohol or drugs or things like that help them to numb themselves. There's an inoculation, that's not the right word, but a numbing quality to these kinds of things that helps to, and I really noticed that, like I stopped drinking a few years back, but I remember noticing that because of getting into a habit of drinking like 3 days a week or whatever. And I started to recognize, okay, this is like what part of what this does is numb and give me an escape from some of the pain that I'm not even really that aware of feeling a lot of the time.
Well, so for Nietzsche, both alcohol and religion are opiates of the masses, all right? And so if you would stop doing those things, being religious and consuming alcohol, then you would be more aware of the problems of your life that are in front of you. And that's painful to be aware of your own problems, but then you'd be maybe more inclined to do something about it. And so if people were less religious and less inclined to drink, they may be more fulfilled by pursuing activities.
And yeah, I guess actually that was kind of what I was getting at, was the rhythm aspect. Outside of yoga itself, you start to be able to, like, once you start to recognize rhythm as causing a sort of calming, assuaging kind of effect, then you start to recognize that that's a lot of what we do in normal life. Your normal thoughts and that sort of thing are all trying to escape and distract yourself, and a lot of them are based on rhythms of habits and that sort of thing that take you away from having to be present with the pain that you're feeling at any given time.
there's a way that people talk about yoga in terms of helping you manage your stress, helping you relax, helping you develop a work-life balance by sort of breaking up your day or something. You know, you wake up in the morning and you do your routines before you go to work, and so that gives you something to do with your own time before you go to work, so you feel like you have your own life and you feel maybe a little bit healthier, your body's more organized. And I don't want to fall into that kind of trap of talking about it that way, because I think that it's wrong in terms of like why we practice yoga, at least as Thelema people. But I also think it's wrong in terms of what yoga actually does, because cultivating any sort of discipline is stressful, and then the kind of stages of awareness that come as you practice add a sort of disquieting, I think a disquieting element to the system. You know, if you, I think I told a story on the podcast a couple of days ago about the guy who wanted, you know, take away the second Kriya because I'm having such a profound existence of God that I cannot even deliver the mail. You know, so the intervention of the yoga experience into life is a disruptive experience, and so if people are looking for the kind of escape that we're talking about, this is not maybe the right place to go. And it also sort of demeans what's actually going on here. Crowley, very early on in this lecture, we're still on the first page, at least of my edition, reminds us of the motto of the equinox. We place no reliance on virgin or pigeon. Our method is science. Our aim is religion. And this is a notoriously difficult word to define, so I'm not going to. But the point is that there's going to be a religious element in yoga practice, and we have to put that up front so that people are aware of it, so it doesn't become covert. There's people who do regular, just I don't even want to say hatha yoga exercises, but like Bikram yoga, not Bikram. What's his name? BKS Iyengar, like Iyengar inspired physical exercises, like the calisthenics school of yoga, that end up thinking of themselves as very spiritual people because they do yoga all the time, but they're not actually doing yoga. They're doing Iyengar calisthenics, inspired by hatha yoga. So, if you don't acknowledge the religious goals up front, they sneak themselves in later, and can be distracting in a number of ways.
Yeah, just as a brief aside, elsewhere Crowley points out the etymology of the word religion as coming from ligere, from Latin, which is to bind. So it's kind of he ties it in, pun intended, to the idea of yoga as well, which yoga, as he emphasizes, means union.
Very good. Yeah. I'm trying to find where he says this kind of explicitly in here. There's a few places where he talks about over-moralizing. Yes, here we go. Let me digress for a moment and brush away one misunderstanding which is certain to occur to every Anglo-Saxon mind. About the worst inheritance of the emasculate school of mystics is the abominable confusion of thought which arises from the idea that bodily functions and appetites have some moral implications. So this is the thing is you have preconceptions about morality, which were cultivated in you by 2,000 years of Christian culture. You believe in the virtue of self-sacrifice and charity, and comporting a life towards other people rather than a life
very oriented.
Altruism, right? You believe in the virtue of altruism, and so if you start doing yoga exercises, this is what he means by bodily functions. You if you start doing yoga exercises and feel good about the exercise you're doing, without doing the Nietzschean style revaluation of all values.
Transvaluation?
Transvaluation of all values. You're just going to believe that you're more and more altruistic, possibly without being more and more altruistic, but also without understanding the virtue of altruism at all, and whether or not that's that's really that helpful. So so the point here, it's religious without being moral as well. And so the question of what we're doing and why, and the fact that it's not for everyone. Yoga's for everybody. No, there are plenty of things you can do. You don't need to do yoga. There's lots of ways to live a life. You don't need to spend hours every day breathing funny.
Yeah, that goes hand in hand with what he also mentions about all types of action are wrong by the thesis of this yoga interpretation, which we're only using particular actions because insofar as they help us to attain non-action.
So after the Second World War, a lot of attempt was made to get objective morality back, because philosophers wanted to be able to say that concentration camps were just objectively evil. So how do we get evil back? But Thelema lives in this little post-Enlightenment place, but also pre-mainstream 20th century philosophy place, where we were able to understand this thing about moral relativism, that some things could be right and wrong for some people and other things right and wrong for other people, and that right and wrong are not the same as good and evil. I think it is true that for all people, concentration camps are a bad scene. Like, nobody would look at that without a large amount of cultural programming and see this as somehow beneficial. But it's because individuals with their individual morality all still have sort of some things in common just by virtue of being human. So we don't need to get back our concept of evil to say certain things are not preferred, like concentration camps are not preferred.
That's the thing. It's like that seems like a whole subject in and of itself, of course, but it's the type of thing cultural programming is, and not just cultural programming, but just programming of the mob in general is a scary thing. And it's kind of trying to make things too easy by saying that this is an objective evil. We carry this stuff inside of us. In order for Romans to completely raze Carthage to the ground and kill every living person in that city, that's takes a serious, some serious commitment. And I would never say that was a good thing, but it's something that humans carry around with them, the capability of doing that, just like lynch mobs actually believe that they're doing something right, and a lot of the time after the fact they still believe that they would do it again, and they believe in what they did. That's disgusting. It happens. It still happens. It's still part of us,
Yeah, I mean, victory in war is better than defeat in war, but if you attain victory, someone else suffers defeat.
Yeah.
And maybe war is just an unjustifiable thing, but individuals can still have conflicts that can still be stressful for those individuals, and that's okay. But the point of the moral relativism thing is that depending on what you're trying to attain, certain things are helpful and certain things are unhelpful. And so it's not that all actions are bad, but it's that if you're trying to do yoga, any activity that isn't yoga is going to tend to take you away from success in yoga. So simplify, in terms of getting into the...
And this is also about context as well. This is one of the things that always gets forgotten about in this kind of subject, when it comes to morals or anything like that. There's a tendency to think that your way of thinking or approaching things is supposed to always be a blanket to cover every circumstance and that sort of thing. But I would say, as Thelemites, we have a particular approach to yoga and a particular mindset that we take on and a particular set of tools that we apply. And then when we're going into a magical exercise, we're going to approach it in a different way with a different set of approaches and tools and mentalities and that sort of thing. So like with yoga, we are aiming for some kind of cessation because we are trying to stop physical movement. We are trying to create rhythms that stop all the distractions that we're used to in our normal functions and that sort of thing so that we can attain to deeper states. That is appropriate, that is good in this circumstance. And things like distractions or movements would be evil in the sense of being at odds with our purpose. Whereas we go into a magical situation or just a mundane situation, and the situation is much different. We're applying different tools and different approaches.
Crowley says here, the goal of yoga, we are to unite the subject and object of consciousness in the ecstasy which soon turns, as we find out later on, into the more sublime state of indifference, and then annihilate both the party of the first part aforesaid and the party of the second part aforesaid. Then there's this thing about cocktail parties, and once you annihilate both parties, many other sort of phantoms arrive that also need to be annihilated. People can apply to our discussion about Liber 150 to learn more about this. Subject and object are going to be confusing for people because for Freud, object always means the mother. And there are a large number of people who are going to think in terms of these psychological terms, in terms of reconciling the, trying to become a subject as you mature, and then having all these objects of desire that are all mother substitutes. But Crowley just means, in the simplest way, the subject of the sentence being the operator, the object of the sentence being the thing operated on, and then the verb. So like, I meditate upon a red triangle. I am the subject. The red triangle is the object. And then we destroy each other by uniting and continue to destroy other objects by uniting with other objects. Why would we want to do this? Crowley says in the paper on duty that one of our duties is to ever expand the domain of our consciousness or something, to become bigger and bigger and in a more profound relationship to the universe. So yoga accomplishes this by doing the process of yoga. We're consuming and being consumed by all of these different sort of psychic objects, expanding ourselves.
So it becomes fundamental to Thelema in Crowley's estimation, of course. And I think this is where Pan as a god comes into play, but I don't want to get too far off topic or anything like that. But
Pan being just everything, right? Pan, when we want to say, like the panopticon is like the prison where everything is always seen. Whenever we say everything always, we use the preface pan.
And, so we have like the Greek word pan, like Pan American Airlines.
Yeah,
or whatever.
Sure.
So it's like
all
covering
American
everything.
Airlines,
and it also applies to the satyr god.
That's right. Sit still, stop thinking, shut up, get out. Shut up and get out are too complicated for what we're doing here today. So we just want to deal with sit still and stop thinking. So the real work of yoga is mental work. As we said, uniting the meditator with the object being meditated upon. But before we do that, we need to eliminate distraction, which we do by training up some asana. Darren, what's an asana?
So this is one of the many terms that we get that we have difficulty with, but we're going to use them anyway, and which is kind of annoying, frankly. And it's just sort of everybody kind of pays lip service to the same sort of process of like, well, there's a lot of clunky, long Sanskrit names that we use, but coming up with the proper English translations is too difficult, so we're just going to continue to use them and make things obscure anyway, which is a shame in my estimation, but I could be wrong. Asana, however you want to pronounce it, it's basically posture. So it's holding a posture that's apparently free and comfortable. I think that's the term.
Yes. I don't think it's in here. I think it's in book 4. But here it says, control of the muscular system, conscious and unconscious, so that no messages from the body can reach the mind.
And theoretically, in free and comfortable, I'm paraphrasing there, I don't remember the exact wording, but it's that's kind of at the as Crowley mentions in Book 4, that's kind of based on the results rather than the actual process of getting there, because the process of getting there is going to be painful.
Here he says to start with something that's kind of pleasing, realize that you're going to get cramps, and keep practicing until you don't get cramps anymore, which could take, weeks or months or whatever of just regular practice. And when you break through the other side, yes, the position, once properly trained, is like the most comfortable position you could possibly get into.
Yeah.
I think in Book 4 it says to start with something uncomfortable, because when you're uncomfortable, you're more aware of the shape of the body, and that these sort of subconscious movements don't occur as easily. But whatever you do, whether you find a comfortable posture or find an uncomfortable posture, the discomfort is coming, so don't you worry.
Yeah. And I think probably it makes sense, the uncomfortable posture aspect of it probably more pertains to making sure that it's something that you're just not going to fall asleep in. Because if your comfortable posture is, say, the corpse posture where you're lying down, chances are it's going to be difficult not to fall asleep or to move and, shift and that sort of thing. So it's nice to find some kind of a posture that requires you to be on your guard. He talks about it being not so much firm and rigid as braced.
I've definitely fallen asleep in dragon pose on my knees with my butt on my heels, spine straight.
It's no fixer.
I've also fallen asleep in the new kind of modified supported half lotus pose that I'm using now. You really shouldn't do this work when you're tired, but I have a child. I'm tired all the time. We have to do work. Last time we talked, Darren, you were reinvesting in this in some of this type of work. Have you continued to do this semi-daily?
Yes, I have, Michael.
I'm on the fucking radio.
Well, I'm glad you asked. Oh, hi. I didn't see you come in. So it's actually about the month mark, I think. Now that since I started reinvesting, as you say, I had gone through a period of just trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do, feeling like I'm refreshing my practices and that sort of thing recently. And what I decided to do was, I'm going to re-engage with Liber E and Liber O and go back to basics, because it's always good to go back to the fundamentals with anything that you're doing, and never to neglect the fundamentals. So I've re-engaged with the Asana practice and the Pranayama practice, and I've been doing them for the past month. The Asana practice, I've copped out and done my favorite pose, the God posture, but I've been very strict about it, and it's been developing nicely. It is one of those things that it's trying to find the right rhythm for it, because, for instance, I'll do either asana in the morning and pranayama in the evening after I get home from work and all that sort of thing, or vice versa. And finding the right way to do that seems to work best for me. As far as asana goes, the difficulty that I find is, the tiredness factor and this kind of, dozing off and that sort of thing. And especially when it's like we're recording this in the summertime in August, we've recently been going through some heat waves and whatnot, and it's the air quality hasn't been great, and I find that I just get drowsy and that sort of thing. So it's finding the best way to counter that, which I usually find if I take a little 15-minute nap beforehand, if I have the luxury of being able to do that, that seems to do the trick, and I'm trying to get in the habit of pursuing that a little bit more. And I find that doing asana in the evening, it would make sense to do it on waking up because you're going to be most refreshed and all that sort of thing. But I actually find that still I tend to be kind of a little bit drowsy in the morning because I haven't had my coffee yet. And that also makes me think that maybe I should attempt to get off of caffeine again, because it gives you a different kind of refreshed feeling in the morning. I remember being a lot more invigorated in the morning on waking up. That's, something I've experienced. Not everybody experiences that and that sort of thing, but that might be something I consider.
The caffeinated beverages, I think, have a old history as being connected to religion, and one of the reasons people think is that because you could have a cup of tea or something before you sit down to practice, and then you wouldn't fall asleep doing repetitive mantra work or something like that. That the little bit of stimulant is supposed to keep you connected from your mind from wandering off, and then the opposite of that is people think also that virtually all yogis use hashish, and that this predisposes one to sitting still and not doing too many actions, and allows one to be less distracted from practice. So both things, both the stimulant and the depressant, are supposed to be supportive of the practice. So maybe you don't want to get into like making a whole pot of coffee, but if you could have some tea or something upon waking. But I find the same thing. It's because we're used to getting up at 7 and having breakfast and going to work. So if we want to add an hour of asana practice, then we get up at 6. And it takes a long time to get used to getting up at 6. So you're just tired, and your body just wants to go back to sleep until 7.
Especially if the first thing you do is just sit quietly for an hour.
Yeah. What's coming up physiologically, psychologically, in terms of breaks or interesting phenomena? Anything like notable?
I find that there's.
How long are you sitting in your posture?
So I sit in the posture for an hour.
Okay.
I initially started with the mentality that I was going to work my way up to an hour. And so I did like 14 minutes the first day, and then I think like however many minutes the second day. And then, but very quickly I decided, you know what? This is going to suck no matter how long I spend at it. So if I'm going to sit there for 20 minutes cursing every minute of it, I might as well sit there for an hour and just, go balls to the wall. So, and that's what I did. And it ended up paying off quite nicely. I do think, like Crowley does actually mention in here something that I took note of that alludes to the idea of working your way up to an hour and then beyond, as opposed to feeling like you have to be doing an hour right out of the gate. But I think that's going to be a matter of individual practice and experimentation and that some sort of thing to some extent. However, I do find that for myself, it's just kind of like, you know what? Yeah, maybe 1 or 2 days testing the water. Okay, fine. But like, you might as well push it and keep yourself, just try and dive into it instead of making a bigger deal out of it than it needs to be.
I always remember this thing because I think it's so funny to just multiply everything by 4. But beginners should start with half an hour or an hour. Serious practitioners should do 4 hours. 16 hours is too much for most people.
Yeah.
But I realized recently on a reread that this is a recommendation for pranayama, not for asana. There is a little bit more room for people to ramp up to this practice, because it is so physically uncomfortable. It's really physically uncomfortable. Here he says, as he was getting towards the end of his training period to really start to break into having the posture ready, it was taking him a full 10 minutes to like sit up after he was done.
Yeah, to pull his one leg out took him 10 minutes of just very slowly, millimeter by millimeter,
and
easing
this
it out.
Is a real thing that really happens to people. People might reading this, some of this stuff that Crowley writes about yoga seems superlative, and like maybe this thing about walking on water, like he never says he can walk on water. He never says he can levitate. He just says other people have seen him levitate. But so many of the things he says that seem crazy, like, oh, it took me like 15 minutes to get off the ground. That's real. That really happens. It really hurts. You get these cramps and seizures.
I remember doing,
and it's okay.
Back in the day, there was a period when I was doing the Dragon Asana, and that was definitely a thing for sure.
And I know that Crowley and Jane Wolfe both at different times in their life were doing the thunderbolt, which is where you sit on one ankle instead of both ankles. I can't imagine. Like I've tried it for like 5-10 minutes at a time, and I really can't get into the posture properly. I can get my left heel up against my anus, but I can't get my right heel to cover the pubic bone, because just my hips won't torque into the right position, and that's okay. Like, you're supposed to be practicing and developing these things. So some amount of physical exercise to get fit, get limber, is appropriate before you take up a posture. But yeah, I can't imagine like an hour and 20 minutes in that thunderbolt posture.
Yeah.
And then important in here, some advice in here is not to imagine that any particular posture has any particular spiritual power or significance. So just because you can sit in like the posture associated with some god or something, that's nice for you, but it's just kind of like an ego boost. It doesn't provide any benefit to practice over and above, just having literally any posture in which you can sit still in.
Yeah.
Something else I wanted to say is that I spent probably 20 years working with the dragon pose. I was taught to me in like a karate class when I was like 14. Then when I started reading the Crowley stuff, it's something I went back to later in high school, and back to again in college, and then back to again after I took my initiation, and then back to again at various points after having some crisis that took me away and coming back. Now I have tendinitis in both legs. There's a thickening of both my Achilles tendons. And so I've had to change my posture so that I'm not sitting directly on my feet, because I don't want the tendinitis to become a chronic condition that affects my mobility throughout my whole life. And this is because I have ignored Crowley's advice and come back to it and back to it and back to it. What you want to do is... as he says in here, it's super, super important to, if you're going to do it, be disciplined about it, do it regularly, do it every day until you've actually mastered the posture. And I would get to a place where I was doing 60 minutes comfortably for a week, and then stop for months at a time, and then have to train up again from ground zero. And I've done myself, after 20 years of not having an asana, I've given myself a real physical injury because I'm starting again and starting again and starting again. Whereas if I had just done it every day, I'm sure I wouldn't be in this position.
Well, this is one of the reasons that I think it's really good to talk about our experiences with this too, because I don't remember if we mentioned this on here already today or if it was before we started recording, but I was saying it's a shame because people tend to talk about what's prescriptive about these practices, but you don't really hear people talking about the nitty-gritty about what they actually experience. And that's one of the things that always comes to mind, like going through practice of trying to do the asana frequently and getting, having to take minutes to get ease out of it afterwards and that sort of thing, and the pain that comes with it. It feels like, okay, there's no way this can't be problematic for something going on here,
Well, I was once doing a class, something where I was like meditating in my posture, and someone was walking around and looking at people, and she was like, "Oh my God, your feet are black." And I said, "You mean like a dark kind of purple, like the circulation?" She was like, "They're like black, like black." And this is fine. Like, I cannot underscore enough that it's okay if your feet go numb. It's okay if if you can't get up. It's okay if you have cramps when you're relaxing. What's important is that you persist with regularity in the practice until you master the posture, and do not spend. You can spend 6 months torturing yourself like this. You can't spend 20 years like I did torturing yourself like this, because eventually you're going to get a chronic strain injury or something. But it's also important, what he says here is, don't imagine that any posture has any special spiritual significance. I liked the dragon because, it was taught to me when I was little, and because it's one of the ones Crowley recommends in his book. And now I'm like, sitting up on a cushion with one leg on the floor and the other leg just kind of in front of that leg. and it's still just as uncomfortable, and my right leg still goes numb, and it still takes me a minute to get up. But I'm less likely to exacerbate my injury, and I'm starting again after a long, long time, and it doesn't feel good. So if you're gonna do it, just do it.
Yeah. When it comes down to it, I mean, that ego boost thing is a real thing, and it's easy to read this warning and take it to heart, and then forget totally all about it, and go about your business, do asana for a few weeks, and start feeling all high and mighty about it and that sort of thing. But this is all means to an end. This is all exercise.
Another interesting thing that happens is if you do get distracted one day. Or if I get distracted one day, like let's say I'll sit for 20 minutes and my phone will ring, like, oh, this could be an emergency with my kid. I should just check it. And then I put the phone down and I try to carry out my posture because it's not an emergency. Then for like 2-3 weeks at a time, I'll get really stressed out, open my eyes and check the timer. And it will be exactly the same time that my phone rang. It only takes one willed incident to leave an echo in your practice that takes weeks and weeks and weeks to iron out. So
you know what? That actually brings to mind something that I wanted to allude to as well, which it's a little outside of this, but at the same time, I think it's really it's part and parcel with the subject matter and that sort of thing. Which is there's a little paper called "The Training of the Mind" by Alan Bennett, which was included in the Equinox Volume 1, Number 5, where Bennett talks about the tendencies. And this is an example of a tendency that starts to come up. And this is one of the reasons that I feel like, I have this ambivalent feeling about the Sanskrit terms, because I feel like, when we're using these traditional terms for all this subject matter, the difficulty I feel like people may run into is that they start thinking about these things as an exotic, different thing. But these are things that exist in reality and that are with you all the time. So we're talking about the way that your thoughts work. So as an example, in this case, if I can be allowed this brief aside, the portion that I'm thinking of in particular is in the marvelous system of psychology which has been declared to us by our teacher, the chitta, or thought stuff, is shown to consist of innumerable elements which are called Dhamma and Sankhara. If we Dhamma or Sankhara, so it's like essentially alluding to the same thing. If we translate Dhamma or Sankhara as used in this context as tendencies, we shall probably come nearest to the English meaning of the word. When a given act has been performed a number of times, when a given thought has arisen in our mind a number of times, there is a definite tendency to the repetition of that act, a definite tendency to the recurrence of that thought. Thus, each mental Dhamma, each Sankhara, tends to produce constantly its like, and be in turn reproduced. So
yeah, these echoes is why you're pointing to this, right? The repetitions of
these are
patterns.
Habits of thought. So I have obsessive compulsive disorder, so I'm acutely aware of thinking of things in this kind of way. The recurrence of habits, not just thought habits, but of all habits. And the more that you observe the mind and that sort of thing, the more you recognize that this is what you're dealing with, is habits. Your habits of thought, your habits of preconception, your habits of just all these patterns that are recurrent.
Yeah. I don't know what more to say about that, but that's right. There's this thing about echoes over time is real and interesting. And when we get in, and if we ever get into talking about the mental aspects of this process, it'll be even more cogent to bring it up. I'm thinking about what you're saying about the using the Sanskrit terms and how it's distracting because it makes it seem magical when talking about the mind, like we just know what minds are. So like, why would we have to have a foreign word to describe.
Well, it's
process
not
of the
so
mind.
much, that wouldn't be the way I would parse it exactly.
Okay.
But like, for instance, like talking about the tendencies, I teach guitar.
Mm-hmm.
When you're learning a musical instrument, you can use the tendencies in your process. You start to recognize that you're training your fingers, which have an automated response and is separate from the way that your thinking tries to deal with things. If you had to think about every single motion that you made with your fingers on the fretboard, then it eats up a lot of brain power. And it's hard to juggle everything that's going on. So what you do is you train by repetition over and over again, your fingers making these movements, and you get them adapting to different movements. And then what happens is you can allow them to do that, and it frees up a lot of your brain power so that your brain can minimize the amount that it has to be engaged and be working on other things.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So you think that there's a way in which some of these things are explicable using a language that's native.
To some extent, and I think like the main thing is, at least if we're going to use these terms like chitta for mind stuff, like at least we can demystify them to some extent so that we can make them, recognize what they're actually applied to and not mystify what they're applied to.
There used to be, and I don't know to what extent there still is, there used to be a question in philosophy about how a non-physical thing could affect a physical thing. So the mind is non-physical, the body is physical. How does our mind control our arm? Like there needs to be some mechanism for the relationship of the non-physical mind and the physical body. But that mechanism would either be physical or non-physical so that it could relate to either, and then we still have this problem. So for a while there was this idea that mind stuff was stuff. It was just stuff in a subtler way than matter is. It's like a refined matter.
Kind of like the ether that things float around in space.
Sure.
Based on.
And I think people no longer believe this. They and I think most people that you want to teach yoga to don't ever meaningfully question, like, how does my mind control my body? Because often they're materialists and they think their mind is just their brain or some electrical movement in their brain or something. They have an explanation for this, which may or may not be true. But it's so helpful to think of the thought as being composed of stuff, like some unruly, like maybe my child plays with this toy called slime, which is like not quite solid and not quite liquid, and you like push it together and then it wants to flow out. And so when you're talking about really refined control of mental processes, thinking of them as having a matter that's finer than gross matter that you can't use muscles to control is so helpful that I think having a word for it, chitta, matters, because it conveys something that people don't usually, like if you just say, focus your mind, they'd say, I can't focus my mind. You're like, well, that's because the mind is water. The mind isn't water. What's wrong with you? Okay, well, the mind is chitta. Asana too, if you just say sit still, people think they sit still all the time. No one ever sits still. There's this process of training. Pranayama, you could say they're breathing exercises, but we want to say that they're breathing exercises that affect the spirit. Again, there's this question of how the material can relate to the spiritual, so we call it prana. I think that learning a new language for something that is a new activity, there's a reason that's helpful.
Makes sense.
Every activity you pick up has a jargon that goes with it,
and that's very true.
It's for a reason. You need to apply these new ideas to draw new associations between words and ideas.
I like that. In fact, I'm very glad that we've had this interaction because it helps to clarify that. That's very useful.
I can see your angle too, right? Like unnecessarily mystifying things with too much technical jargon is just gatekeeping and confusing and makes you seem like you have an authority when all you have is your own coded language. So simplifying as much as we can and communicating in plain English, I think is something that Crowley tried to do. But that would be the other argument for why we need to use Sanskrit terms for some things.
Yeah.
What are the three things we need to look for when we're training a new asana for ourselves?
The three things that we need to look for. Well, Crowley says, but there are no rules.
There's 3 rules.
These tricks may help or may hinder. It is up to you to find out which are good and which are bad, the why and the what, and all other questions. What are you alluding to with these 3 particular things to look forward?
Why then should we bother to choose a specifically sacred position? Firstly, we want to be steady and easy. Let me start that again. Firstly, we want to be steady and easy. We want, in particular, to be able to do pranayama in that position if ever we reach the stage of being able to attempt that practice. We may therefore formulate, roughly speaking, the conditions to be desired in the posture as follows. 1. We want to be properly balanced. 2. We want our arms free. They are used in some pranayama. 3. We want our breathing apparatus as unrestricted as possible. So, 1 and 3 mean that the spine needs to be straight, and then 2 means we can't be like doing any kind of weird handstand or sitting on our hands or anything. So just regular cross-legged, as long as your hips are open enough to be able to pitch forward slightly and have your spine grow up from your centered hips is good enough. You need a straight back, properly balanced, with your arms free, because the pranayama Crowley most likes is Nadhi Shodhana, which is alternate nostril breathing. So you need to close your left nostril with your left thumb and then your right nostril with your right thumb. And so you need to be able to move your hands and then be able to open the chest so that you can breathe deeply and comfortably. So those are the 3 things when you're picking an asana. Other than that, you are free to do as you please. Also, try not to fall asleep. You're right about that.
And don't give up on your asana that you've chosen just because it doesn't seem to be working out and you think that maybe switching to a different one will help.
That's right. This is why I resisted changing posture for so long. And, when you said you took did you say lazy way out by doing, you should just do the posture that you can always, that you always do until you have it locked, barring any serious health complaints. If you do it for, no, I don't even want to say that. I was going to say if you do it for a week and it seems wrong and you change it, the faster you change it, the better. You don't want to do it for 2 weeks and then change it, because then you're probably not changing it because it's the wrong posture. You're probably changing it because you're avoiding the work of pushing through it.
Yeah, and a big part of what we're dealing with here is countering the distractions that we're constantly dealing with. And if your asana itself becomes a distraction in that way, where you're suddenly swapping it out and changing it up, then that's just feeding into that. So we're trying to counter that. I mean, it's just like sitting there for an hour in the first place. The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to be incredibly bored for an hour. It's going to be a painful boredom. It's going to take some time to get used to even just that. And even then, it's like it can continuously be boring, for an ongoing way. And I mean, I remember mentioning to somebody that I was doing what is entailed in asana, and it's just the look of horror on the person's face. It's pretty amusing, and it does make you stop and stand back and say, yeah, you know what? I can understand how that's having to sit there for a full hour is a daunting idea. But then again, like sitting there for a full hour and practicing guitar seems like a daunting idea when you're not used to the concept.
This is one thing, is getting used to slices of time that are 1 hour long. The chitta starts to build get used to rhythms. So if you're used to watching situation comedies, you might live in 22-minute slices. If you're used to watching, evening dramas, you might live in 44 or 55-minute segments. If you're used to, watching YouTube, you might live in 2 or 3 minute segments. And then if you find that after a sustained practice of asana, you tend to give up. Like if you set a timer for 61 minutes or something, which is what I do, and then you check to see if that timer's still working after 52 minutes, then you end up living in 52-minute slices where again and again and again for week after week after week, you continue to check the timer at 52 minutes and make sure it's still working. This is my biggest type of break is the is the battery in my electric timer gone out? I keep wondering that, and it's my excuse for opening my eyes. And then this thing about pain, there is the distraction of the pain, but you're right, the distraction of the just like the anxiety of like, oh, can I do something else now? Have I been sitting here long enough? How many more minutes? After 55 minutes, what's another 6 minutes? Like, you should just go to your 61 minutes. But it's so hard. It's so hard. And this is why Crowley says in here, it's better to squirm for an hour than to sit perfectly still for 59 minutes. Because that little crack in the discipline. So if you start having these breaks, if you have a stretch, or if you have or if you open your eyes and you peek at the clock or whatever, you just have to stick it out. And then you realize that once you start moving, it becomes harder and harder to stick it out. If you'd never moved, maybe you would have gone through all the way to the end.
I know we want to move on to pranayama, but just briefly, like the approach to music again is kind of pertinent to this, because I feel like when you're dealing with an instrument, you go through a lot of the same things, and I feel like learning to really engage with guitar practice, and that was my first experience of yoga. First direct, clear experience of that, because trying to sit there and focus is a process that you have to get used to, and you kind of have to break through a barrier of resistance that comes up. And then what happens is when you're dealing with music, the nice thing about it is you've got something tangible in front of you that makes it easier, and an experience that is more direct, that is much easier to go through that process and have real checkpoints that are very clear and in front of you. So like you're initially resisting the process of practicing, and your mind wants to be anywhere else and is thinking about all these other things, but gradually you stop things down to a form of tunnel vision where you're present and you're there. And it's hard to stop after that, because you build a momentum that keeps moving forward, and it's hard to pull yourself away from practice at a certain point. With these yoga practices, I think that you're going to experience the same thing through practice actually paying off, but it's a harder thing to engage with, I think, than something like a musical instrument.
Because the practice itself offers you no distractions from practice.
Yes.
You can practice your scales and practice your scales and practice your scales, and then play Smells Like Teen Spirit and still be practicing. Yeah. But you can't sit still and sit still and sit still and then have a stretch and still be practicing.
Yeah.
I wonder if trying to live in 1 hour slices would help. Like if you sit down to practice guitar, set a timer for 1 hour. If you sit down to read, set a timer for 1 hour. Get accustomed to what 1 hour feels like. So, because if you watch an hour-long TV show and it's only 48 minutes long, you might think that an hour is 48 minutes long and start getting stressed out when you realize it's longer.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, people will probably think that's semantic, but it really isn't, because there's subconscious cues and things going on in your mind that aren't as straightforward as that. The
mind is a trainable substance and gets used to the idea of being in a specific shape. Here we go. Let's just read this section before we end. Let me digress for a moment. You digressed. Crowley's also allowed to digress. And refer to what I said in my textbook on magic with regard to the formula of IAO. This formula covers all learning. You begin with a delightful feeling, as of a child with a new toy. You get bored, you attempt to smash it. But if you are a wise child, you have a scientific attitude towards it, and you do not smash it. You pass through the stage of boredom and arise from the inferno of torture towards the stage of resurrection, when the toy has become a god. The chosen posture attracts you. You purr with self-satisfaction. It is quite clear that there is something wrong with this. Fortunately, time is the great healer, and is on the job as usual. Before very long, you forget all about the pleasantness of the thing. So, the stage from, new posture to actually working on your posture to hopefully the toy becomes a god, which just means fully integrated and you participated with it. And as you say, it's hard to tear yourself away from your practice.
You've created a union with it. You've performed yoga. Your
first union with your posture before you even attempt meditation proper. Mm-hmm. What is pranayama? And we've already said that it's control
of breath, usually translated as control of breath.
Yeah, but how do you do it?
We go back to the idea of rhythm here, because we want to slow it down, and we want to make it rhythmical. Although he does say that there's a few different possible approaches to breathing. For instance, there's one where you're breathing as fast as possible.
So Durga Pranayama, there are 3 different ways in the body. This is not in our text. This is just different possible. Durga Pranayama, there are 3 different ways in the body to admit breath. The first thing is to drop the diaphragm. Then the next thing is to kind of expand the rib cage out to the side. And then the last thing is to lift the sternum. And Durga Pranayama is regularizing these things such that all 3 stages are even, and then they reverse. You relax the belly first, then you relax the rib cage, then you drop the chest. So you go in from the bottom up and then out from the bottom up. And that's Durga Pranayama. It just means taking a full breath using the whole body, whole lung, and the whole muscular system to drive it. Kapalabhati means to force the breath out of the lungs by a contraction of the muscle of the diaphragm, and then by relaxation of the muscle of the diaphragm, allow the breath back in. And that sounds like... I started too fast, but by the time I was done, I was really doing it. Crowley's favorite, though, is Nodhi Shodhana, which is the alternate nostril breathing, and that's because it draws energy into those channels that I was talking about before, the Ida on the left side of the body and the Pingala on the right side of the body, and tends to try to balance them and open the Sushumna. He will say that this is all Hindu moralizing. He doesn't want to talk about metaphysics right here. He wants you to prove through experience what's going on. But this is what Nati Shodhana does. What's the mechanism of the practice?
The mechanism of
practice. What are you actually doing?
So literally what we're doing is we're breathing out through the left nostril for 30 seconds, then breathing in for 15 seconds. Or, sorry, is it 10 seconds to start with? 10 seconds to start with.
I think 15 sounds better to me.
Well, I mean, let's read this outright so we're getting it correct. This simply means that you get a stopwatch and choose a cycle of breathing out and breathing in. Both operations should be made as complete as possible. The muscular system must be taxed to the utmost to assist the expansion and contraction of the lungs. When you have got this process slow and regular, for instance, 30 seconds breathing out and 15 in, you may add a few seconds in which the breath is held, either inside or outside the lungs. I think at some point I don't remember if it's here or if it's in Liber E, he says that breathing out should be 3 times as long as breathing in?
Twice as long, I think. Usually.
Twice as long, okay.
Yeah, that's why he says 30 and 15.
That's right. You know what 20. It is? I think it's in Liber O. I think we're supposed to start with 20 out, 10 in, and then the next stage of the process is 30 out, 15 in. And this is the process that I've been
Right.
going through the past month. And I've gotten to the next stage of the process, which is 15 out, 15 in, hold for 15. And I just started that
Whoa, good
last
for
night.
you. How's that going? That's a lot of... Moving from one stage to the next is quite stressful, isn't it?
It is. The first time is like very, very, very stressful, and it's finding the right rhythm of it. I think that's the big thing is the pacing, because like for instance, getting used to doing 30 out was very tricky at first. As you say, the first transition into that is the trickiest phase of it, and it's like because it's so easy to just breathe out fast. He does mention as well. The idea behind breathing out slowly seems that if you breathe out too fast, it's like you're losing, it's a loss of energy, and he thinks that there's something to that.
That's right. Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for mentioning that, Darren.
You're welcome, Michael.
Let's stay on the fucking radio. This is just my guess, but it makes it easy to remember kind of when to hold the breath and when to and sort of how that movement should work. I kind of imagine that when I'm drawing air into the left through the left nostril, it's going into that left lung, activating the Ida channel on the left side of the body, and then you hold, and then you want to exhale through the opposite nostril, so that you always hold on the inside on the indrawn breath, and then switch nostrils after that hold on the indrawn breath, so that if you draw breath into the left lung, as we're imagining, that same breath then gets expelled from the right lung. And so somehow the energy has to travel across the bottom of the abdomen to get out on the opposite side. And this is how I imagine the Kundalini at the base of the spine starts to get stirred up, so that you can start to enliven that snake, so he comes up the Sushumna, up through the center of the body. I don't know if this is the doctrine or not. This is something I just kind of made up, but it serves as a mnemonic for myself to remember how these patterns work. You hold the breath on the inhale, and you change nostrils when the belly is full, not when the belly is empty. There are versions of this, and he even says in here, you can choose to hold the breath when the lungs are empty. That's okay. And there's a square breathing pattern that I've done before, where you hold at both the inhale and the exhale. But most of the beginning practices, where in both Liber E and Book 4, you're doing what I'm describing, holding the breath on a full belly and changing nostrils from the inhale to the exhale. So the little mnemonic of like, oh, I'm moving the breath across the bottom of my body from the right lung to the left lung helps you remember to do that.
Yeah, and this is I think that also goes back to what you were saying about your argument for using these other terms and thinking about the mind stuff in this way and thinking about these things in this way. This is, again, we're dealing with intangibles. Just like I was saying, you can actually have the guitar in front of you and hear the results of it and all that sort of thing. In this case, the way that we're dealing with these things and moving things around is by visualization. So this is like perfectly to your point.
What's any like interesting notes that you've had from the month of pursuing these practices?
So far, it's not like I can say that I've been bouncing around like a frog or anything like that.
No, that's not really what I mean. If that had been your experience, I would be happy to hear about it. But I just want to know if there's any subtle, like, tips and tricks or weird annoyances or... Definitely,
especially this time of year and with the way that the weather's been recently. I don't have air conditioning at my place. It's generally pretty decent, but it's like when then when it gets really bad, the air quality can really suck. And I found that to be problematic. So that definitely, there was 2 days in there where I just couldn't do the breathing for the full hour. So it was, I just had to.
Your lungs felt wet from the humidity or something?
Oh, it's just the strain seemed so painful, like muscular, on the muscular level and that sort of thing. And it just, it was just not happening. And, I tried to persist in it and was just sort of like, I had to give in to the fact. Generally, I've been pretty good at persisting through, anything that's holding me back and that sort of thing. But in those cases, that the 2 days there, I had to sort of just accept the fact. But then again, I was thinking to myself, well, here I am complaining about this, and meanwhile Crowley was doing it in some place that's got to be a tropical climate, and who knows how much humidity would have been. The
regularity of practice that he was able to display, I was complaining, right? Like, oh, I've had to change my posture because like my legs hurt, or I've had to change my posture, and or I've had to change my posture sometimes, or like I've had to take breaks in practice because I have bronchitis. I'm a person who gets bronchitis, so I'll be sick for like 3 months with just like heavy lungs. Or if you read the diaries from Crowley's walk across China, first of all, he's walking across China, so that's hard work. And he's trying to get his HGA attainment, so he's doing Liber Samekh. I'm not clear on whether it's 3 times or 9 times a day, but he's doing it a lot. And then he gets some sort of tropical fever, which actually lands him in the hospital for a couple of days. And while he's sick, before the hospital visit, continuing to hike every day with a guide, or maybe he's going down the river at this point or something, he gets a letter from his wife informing them that their very young daughter has died. And he journals it and talks about what it was like doing practice that night. He just keeps doing it.
Yeah.
And it's so important to just keep doing it. What was it like after giving yourself a break for 2 days in a row because of the heat to go back to doing it for a full hour? Was there extra strain, or was it okay?
It was okay.
Yeah?
And it really did come down to the air quality, I think.
Okay.
So that really did make a huge difference in this case. I know what you mean. There's sometimes that'll be for instance, with physical exercise, if I'm doing a workout kind of thing, and then I fall off of that for a few days or whatever, then getting back into it can be, oh my God, it's like, the whole slog all over again. But, I was kind of worried about that, frankly. And in fact, I was worried about upping the level shortly after that, but I managed to get through it anyway. That was another thing, like how soon to up the levels. And I think that might be why, things are kind of left a little bit like, it's not like a specifically regimented in terms of how long you're supposed to do it before you go to the next level up, because it's probably going to vary. It's going to be, you got to sort of feel it out. But my mentality on that, particularly in this case, I ended up giving 2 weeks, and then I wanted to try upping the level. And then that way I figured I'd get into a good rhythm with things, and then I could see how things are feeling to up the level. And that's what I've done, and I managed to stay consistent with that so far. But I feel like, that's not necessarily going to work for everyone under all circumstances. Maybe upping the level sooner might be worthwhile. I don't know, but maybe you'll have to spend a little bit more time in a particular place.
Well, Book 4 says the beginner should do 30 minutes to an hour. And then Liber E says not to graduate yourself to harder work until it's perfect, until the first practice is perfectly easy for 1 hour.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like what you're having is some success, and so I imagine, whether or not you would say it was perfectly easy or not, I don't know, but that you're getting to a place where the practice is regular enough in those 2 weeks before you let yourself graduate.
Something I learned from music is that if you just keep persisting in the same place, it seems like, okay, well, that's probably going to be good. Maybe I should stick to it for a month, just the one level. But what actually happens in reality is you have a quick learning curve and then you plateau. And then you might even get worse if you keep persisting just in the same way. So keeping yourself adapting to some extent works really well in music. So in this case, I'm kind of approaching it with the same mentality where it's like, okay, once I get comfortable, push. Just like with working out as well. You want to keep pushing yourself rather than getting too comfortable just in one place.
What are your breaks like? Like, is it just that you notice, oh, I exhaled a little quickly this time? Or does it actually, do you actually have to stop and catch your breath and start again?
Initially, like I think mostly in that first day or two of transitioning over to the new one, I'll have to stop and readjust. And it's sort of part of the process, I think, of just getting into the rhythm of like the timing of the breathing and that. But yeah, that'll be something that happens, I'll say probably twice in the sitting. I'll have to stop and maybe, blow my nose or just reassert my breath or whatever. And then, outside of that, there will be times where I'll be breathing out a little too fast, but still be able to maintain and still get back on track. And there'll be a temptation to stop, but because there's like that out of breathness and the strain. But that again is I would attribute to just sort of trying to find the right rhythm.
It's amazing how hard it is for 10 minutes, and then how easy it is for 45 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
And then how hard it is again for just another 4 or 5 minutes.
Well, that again is like, I find with both the asana and with the pranayama, I find that the often the last 10 minutes will be where glorious results are had.
I see.
But everything up until that point is kind of like, a bit of, just wrestling with yourself to make sure everything stays on track.
Wow, I find the opposite. I find those last 10 minutes a real push. And I can do 45 minutes maybe. It's hard to know because you're not looking at the clock the whole time. But I can do 45 minutes and think, man, this is so easy. I'm just going to sail through to the end of this thing. And then 5 minutes later be like crippled. Or sometimes I'll think, this is so easy. I must be, and then there's somehow there'll be a temptation to look and realize that I've only been sitting there for 10 or 15 minutes. Oh, brutal.
You know what? That's one of the things I notice as well with the dozing off. Like when I'm dozing off constantly through asana practice for the hour, that's the worst because you'd think, dozing off, it'll go by like no time as a result of that because that'll just contribute to the, losing track of time. No, it's the opposite. It seems like it like when I doze off for just like, it seems like I'll be in it for 20 minutes and then like I'll start, jerk a little bit and that'll wake me up. And then maybe I'll glance at the clock and it's only been 3 minutes. It's God. Like, it's brutal. And every time is like that. Well, to your point of his superlative, just the way that he talks about things tends to seem pretty exaggerated. Like when he's saying like the muscular system must be taxed to its utmost to assist and the expansion and the contraction of the lungs. I think because he consistently uses this kind of language, it sounds intense. Like everything sounds so intense all the time. So it sounds like how far are you supposed to be pushing everything? Are you supposed to be like feeling like, how much tension are you supposed to be feeling in the asana when you're holding the asana and that sort of thing?
There are some photos of Crowley doing this practice where he just inclines his head slightly towards the floor on the exhale and just slightly towards the ceiling, pulling his shoulders back on the inhale. And he says the reason he took those photos, it's quite a big deal to take photos in like the 1920s,
You had to go to the studio.
Is that he found students were trying to do the practice without effort. And so that that physical change in posture is supposed to show the work that he's doing to control the breath. And I think partly too is the fact that you've spent all this time training up an asana. You want to use it, and he says here that your arms need to be free in your asana so that you can do pranayama in the posture. So the idea that you would move any more than the minimum amount of movement required to close the nostrils or whatever is surprising. So I think he's showing you this little gesture that is the result of the muscle structure opening and then contracting the lungs, the diaphragm, the abdomen, the whole thing. But if you just do this experiment, maybe there are people listening to this who haven't done like real breath control work, but if I'm talking and I'm almost there, there's a moment when I get off breath. I can still keep speaking, but I have to push. And so with Dirga Pranayama, that feels like a full exhale. I'm continuing to talk without inhaling more. Again, feels like a full exhale, but I still have enough breath in me to drive. And I think that was the bottom. So it's not necessarily that you need to artificially feel that you're doing a lot of work. Like, don't flex your abs if you don't need to flex your abs. But the idea of pushing till the lungs are really contracted and inhaling till the instrument is really full. I mean, again, I can do the same demonstration. And I think that's about the top, right? Like, hopefully the recording picks that up. You can see how you can keep breathing after a full breath. And what you want to aim for in this practice is a smooth fullness, so that the exhales are really exhales and the inhales are really inhales.
Yeah, I'm glad I shelled out for the expensive mics with the prana sensor.
Yeah, is that what that little thing is there on the side? That's pretty neat.
Oh no, that's just a big gunk.
Oh, I see.
Well, according to the tradition, like one of the things that comes up here is because he doesn't talk about the prana movement in the way that you were describing.
That's right. He doesn't.
But he does talk about the nuts and bolts of the actual physical acts that we're involved with here. He says also that when it comes to the period of holding the breath, according to tradition, if you can hold the mind still for as much as 12 seconds, you will get one of the highest results of yoga. And I think the idea being that during the holding stages of the breath, that's where you're more likely to be able to do the real work of holding the mind still.
None of this is yoga yet, right? This is preparatory work. Yoga is the process of... Yoga proper is this process of meditation, of holding the mind. There's one teacher I was watching who said that, if you imagine, Crowley's favorite example is the red triangle. Let's say you're trying to hold this red triangle. Concentrating is realizing that you've become distracted and bringing the mind back to the triangle, bringing the mind back to the triangle, bringing the mind back to the triangle. So you have to do lots and lots and lots of concentrating before you can even begin meditating. Meditating is realizing that the shape is there and stable and staying, and that you're not thinking about anything else. And this is even preparatory to concentration, to still all of the physiological movements of the body, so that you can start doing concentration, so that you can then start doing yoga. I mean, really, yoga sort of refers to the whole process, but people will say like, oh, I downloaded that new Headspace app and I meditated for like 15 minutes this morning. No, you didn't. Meditating is a
stage of the process.
Dharana is concentration. Not until you're doing dhyana are you actually
that's a worthwhile distinction. And just to bring an analogy to that real quickly, like the musical instrument thing, it sort of feels like that's like you initially when you're sitting down to practice, there's that whole phase of bringing your focus in, which would be the concentration that you're talking about. It's the process of getting focused and into that state of mind. When you reach that sort of tunnel vision state, that seems like the actual meditation proper, if I'm not misunderstanding you.
It's one of the advantages of BKS Iyengar school of physical exercise that everyone thinks is yoga, is that when you do some of these very, very difficult things, it's hard to think of anything else. It does focus you entirely on what's going on. So you do attain sort of a yogic focus for a moment. You get a glimpse of what the exercise should be like. And here, the pranayama, it's not the stress of holding the lungs full or holding the lungs empty, although that requires a lot of focus too. But when you really are relaxed and doing the practice well, there is still that stillness in breathlessness that Crowley's talking about. It's a real thing that you can experience and see that this relationship of the mind stuff going and doing tendencies to the physiological tides in the body. And if you can slow those down and stop them, there really is a relationship between the mind stuff and the physical stuff. Thank you for reading that quote. That's what I was looking for.
Nice.
Do you experience that when you have the breath held for those couple of seconds? Do you notice that it's different than when you're inhaling and when you're exhaling?
I've only added that breath, like just in terms of the present practice. I've only added that in basically yesterday.
Okay.
So today was the second time doing that this morning. So I can't speak too strongly to it just yet, I think, because it's still a little bit getting into the process. So I'll sort of withhold judgment for the time being.
I think the last thing we desperately need to cover, and then we can cover anything else we want. Now, this funny thing about suicide.
Oh yeah,
we
want to still the body, but by shooting yourself in the head, you're not actually stilling the body. You're just releasing the control, which I thought was a really interesting subject that he alludes to.
You're releasing the control and releasing violent forces. Doctrines of reincarnation and like afterworldliness generally are really sort of important. People complain about like spiritual bypassing, which is a buzzword someone came up with recently that means like becoming so focused on your religious practice that you ignore real problems in the real world. Spiritual bypassing is the point. It's not a bug in the system. It's literally what you're doing. The world is suffering. You want to escape.
Get out.
So Buddhism is for spiritual bypassing. Yoga in the Hindu schools is it's not for escaping, but it's for putting yourself in correct relationship. Which means being absolved from a lot of the suffering, and then in the Thelemic contexts, when we're learning what our job is, what our work in the world is, and then especially when we're practicing yoga, as all activities extraneous to yoga tend to damage our ability to practice yoga. It becomes mandatory to ignore lots and lots of stuff. And, you have one job, and maybe your job is, you do peace activism. Like, okay, so you're not ignoring the world. But then you have to ignore, in order to focus on that, you have to ignore all kinds of other positive goods that you could be doing. Spiritual bypassing is the point. It's not a bug in the system. It's what it's for. Partly. So this thing about reincarnation becomes really, really important because if one reincarnates and one commits an act of violence oriented towards the self, then you're going to experience the consequences of that in future incarnations. But also, suicide is an act of violence actually outwardly expressed. Part of it is like, oh, those guys are going to be sorry when I'm gone. They're going to feel like it's because, it's not that you've killed yourself. It's that the bully at school killed you by neglect and didn't realize what he was doing or something. And so there's a theory of suicide that it's a violent act, not against the self, but expressed outwardly to try to destroy something, the equilibrium of the people around you. And so partly you don't want to do that kind of damage that doesn't absolve you from suffering. It creates a bunch of suffering for a bunch of other people, and then you're dead, which is an undefinable state. We don't know what that's like. And then the third thing is, if you want other people to be free of suffering too, this is a big thing in yoga and meditation, other schools like it, is not quite evangelism, but that you sort of have this vague hope for the absolution, not the absolution, the liberation of all beings. That if everyone in your cult kills themselves, it's very unlikely other people will join the cult. So they don't get, if you read all the doctrines and it leads to suicide, you need some way for that not to happen. So for many reasons that are inclusive of reincarnation, but don't necessarily require that as a doctrine, we want something else to do that stops these processes rather than just to shoot yourself. Does that all, maybe that seems like way too much text to explain something that's sort of a joke, but I think there are real reasons not to kill yourself. Well, there's also, even if life is suffering.
You could think of it in the perspective of if you're seeing yourself as being a pattern, like these are the tendencies that are recurring patterns going on right now. If you were to shoot yourself in the head with the intention of stilling those patterns don't just still from something like that. They'll go forward, whether you believe in reincarnation or not. There's still like ripples going outwards in some way. So by this whole theory of things, like he mentions, you're just taking the control out. So you no longer have any control over those patterns at this point. So what we need is to use the control to still those patterns, and we will use specific patterns in order to still the overall patterns. So we'll use, going back to the idea of like all action is a problem for us by the thesis of this description of yoga. We're going to specifically use certain actions in order to still the whole.
Yeah, I think that's right. This idea of releasing violent energy, if releasing violent energy is creating more patterns, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Perpetuating them. Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to talk about whatever the hell this is? The classical physical results of pranayama are usually divided into 4 stages. Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. This is like one of those. So we have, before you have been doing it very long, things are pretty certain to begin to happen, though this, I regret to remark, is fun to you, but death to yoga. So, and it does seem like this is a recurring sort of thing when it comes to yoga and the idea of accumulation of magical powers and that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, you'll start to get magical powers. There'll be a problem because you don't want magical powers. They'll just be a distraction from the actual goal, which is...
My explicit goal is magical powers.
Which you've always said.
Yeah.
So
I may be the exception to that rule.
Well, it's like, of course, you get into magic.
Why?
Because magic. So why? Why not bring this out in the open and talk about it? But I have heard it said that the idea of magical powers is what allures people into the path, and then once they're in there, it's too late by the time they get so deep to realize that the magical powers are actually just a distraction from the real goal, and so now you are deeper into the path and you realize, theoretically, this seems to imply that you gain a deeper wisdom and suddenly you have a right relationship to the nature of the universe and the nature of being and the nature of how to express the true will underlying things. Is that the case? Are we just being fooled into some weird little cult where we dress up and kill goats or something like that?
I've never killed a goat. I just want to say on mic, I've never.
I have not killed a goat either. Although I did at one point want to, not out of any kind of maliciousness, but I wanted to kill a goat in the halal manner because I felt like, to me, it felt like, okay, you know what? I'm eating meat off the shelves all the time and I've never killed an animal. How distanced am I from that? And I felt like by actually killing an animal with my own hands in something resembling a religious manner, that could be a form of a union for me with that animal.
Bring on the frogs.
There we go.
Bring on the frogs.
That's referring to the Crowley's ritual of crucifying a frog, I imagine.
Yeah, let's get this. If you can get goat meat anywhere, let's get familiars.
There we go.
Let's get explicitly anti-Christian familiars going. Surely you've experienced this perspiration thing, if not magical perspiration, at least ordinary perspiration, given that you've been doing this in goddamn August.
Yeah.
Is there anything interesting about the perspiration?
Not especially, no. And I remember going through this in the past with previous, working through the pranayama practices and stuff, and being really excited about the idea of perspiration. So when I started perspiring, I would try rubbing it into my skin, as he says, you can rub it into your skin, and I forget what the particular efficacy.
I think it's something to do with your musculature, like invigorates or relieves or
creates a glow or some.
Do better muscles.
Hors rouge.
Yeah,
ladies rub the pranayama sweat into their skin.
Yes, that's right.
No, I didn't. I have not noticed any particular interesting results of the perspiration as yet. I'm hoping maybe this time around. I have fooled myself in the past into believing that I had automatic rigidity, although I don't know if I was fooling myself or if... And I remember that being associated, I think in the past, I'm just going by memory here, so I haven't consulted my diaries from way back when or anything like that, but I think I might have mixed up my results and thought that the automatic rigidity was associated with the asana. So when you get to a certain stage and you hit automatic rigidity where it just clicks in, and I had that in my head, I think.
I do feel an intense kind of body stillness when doing the asana practice. Even if it's going to be an unsuccessful day, there's always a moment where I feel like just really dropped in.
Yeah, when you've learned it, when you've learned the asana to a certain extent.
And then I will say that recently, doing certain kinds of meditation work that are designed to ignite spiritual fires, maybe to kind of inflame the self in prayer or whatever. I've been having automatic movements of my head, and it's not the first time, where like my head will I'll start nodding or shaking my head, or it'll rocket way back and then roll around. I can gain control, like I can do willed action to put the head back where it goes, but it's not a willed action for those. Like this starts happening. And for people who can't see, I'm really moving.
Yeah, I forgot about that. You've been moving your head this whole time. To these, just now he's been shaking his head like The Exorcist or something.
On its own.
Not The Exorcist, but Frankenstein's monster.
This starts on its own and needs to be grabbed and pulled back. And what I think is happening is that Kundalini is kind of moving through the system, and it hits a chakra that's not properly balanced or not properly sealed or something, and so the physical body tries to get out of the way so the energy can move around it somehow. That's like a wild guess. And then reading through this again, I thought, this is something like jumping about like a frog, unbalanced automatic movement, but it only happens above the neck. I'm not blowing around the room or anything.
Yeah,
like
what
this.
he talks about is one of the results being jumping about like a frog. That's the next one to move on to. So that's, and more specifically what he's talking about is, as he describes it, kind of starting to flutter around like a leaf in the wind. So the idea being that you seem to be defying gravity and normal physics in that sense, where you're, and I think he described, okay, well, I mean, that seems like a preliminary, or at least he gets the impression that perhaps it's a preliminary, or there's a theory that it's a preliminary to the levitation, and it's levitation being done incorrectly or incompletely.
Yeah, the doctrine, it says in here anyway, the doctrine, at least what he calls the Hindu doctrine, is that that pranayama makes the body light, but if you're not perfectly sort of cleansed by pranayama, the beginning of this lightness is crooked, and so that's why you move around instead of floating up in the air. And as you continue to purify the nerve channels, which is what they're called. I don't know if nerves are actually channels, but that's what they're called in yoga. That the levitation will tend to be more and more vertical, and you'll go straight up. Crowley says in his Confessions, I think, somewhere, that he walked in on Alan Bennett in like a tent, and Alan Bennett was still like in his nice lotus posture, but 3/4 of the way upside down, resting on his left shoulder and the side of his head.
Yeah, but like he'd been photoshopped and moved into a different position.
And Crowley just walked in and like picked him up and put him back in his chair, like on his like little cushion or whatever. And Alan Bennett then came to and said like, "Why are you touching me? It's weird." It's like, well, because you were upside down. It didn't look comfortable.
It seems to be something that, like, because he mentions the fact that he doesn't know that he's ever actually done the frog thing, jumping around like a frog, but he's been, others have said that they've seen him doing that, but he has no reason to believe it.
There's at least one story I remember of someone witnessing him in levitation, that they were around a campfire or something, and he just laid back in his chair and closed his eyes. And Crowley's experience was of kind of going to sleep, but the witness saw him sort of glow with an internal light, and he didn't actually see the chair lift off the ground, but the sense was that he was 2 or 3 feet taller than he was before, so must have been lift. Like, you know, if you're looking at someone's face, you don't see where the chair legs are, but the sense was of him rising straight up in the air.
Yeah, he was in book 4, part 2. There's like a little interlude, and then I think where he's talking about Kabbalistic interpretations of nursery rhymes, and then I can't remember. I think it's immediately after that. If I'm remembering correctly, he suddenly goes into. I think he mentions the Tao Te Ching, or the Tao in general, and Lao Tzu's teachings and whatnot, and he goes into such a euphoric state. If only I could write something so insightful in that. And then he goes into this euphoric state, and his scribe, was it Mary Dusty Sturgis at the time? I believe she's the one taking down his words the whole time, and so she describes him as suddenly going into this meditative state where he's like glowing golden. And does he levitate in that description?
I don't remember, but
I can't remember. I feel like that might have been the case, but I could be wrong. But anyway,
he says of levitation, I don't know about this at all. I never saw it happen. On the other hand, I have often felt as if it were happening. And on 3 occasions, at least comparatively reliable people have said that they saw it happening to me. I don't think that proves anything.
So that gives us the four different results, and that makes it seem as if these are what we're doing it for. Is that the case?
I think we're doing it for preparation for meditation.
It seems like the stillness in the holding of the breath being where we can really do the concentration in the initial stages. seems like it's being alluded to as the goal.
I had this a couple of weeks ago. I just wrote down, thoughts are imperfections in the body, which seemed right to me at the time. I don't know what it means, but if pranayama cleans out the nerve channels, physically lightens the person so that they levitate, and balances you so that levitation is directly vertical. If you're so still that you can be picked up without breaking your posture, like this automatic rigidity thing, like if what you want is to have no physical distraction so that you can start to work to focus your mind, then all this stuff that may or may not be literally happening to you is evidence of this kind of cleanness and simplicity of the physical body that allows you to do the more complicated mental work associated with meditation.
I think one of the things that we could also touch on is the fact that the inverse of this, not just the results of actually doing the practices, but the results or the effects of stopping the practices makes a very pronounced difference as well. We can actually see how our experience of daily life is suddenly very different when we're outside of practices. That's something I've always really strongly noticed over the years as well, which is you may get to the point, because of the regularity of practices, that if you're doing them day after day, you might get to the point where you're just so comfortable in that you don't recognize the full effects that these things have been having on your experience and your mind and everything outside of the practices themselves when you're just in normal life. But then when you've stopped doing them, say for a couple of weeks or whatever, you very quickly start to really recognize the noisiness of your mind, for instance. And you might notice a lot of other changes going on as well.
For me, it's more like skill at existing. Like if I'm not doing practice, life becomes rudderless and confusing, and I'm maybe achieving no less. Like I may still write just as much, or I may still, have just as good a time with my son, or if I'm doing some kind of a job, it's not that I'm less good at the job, but there is a lack of, maybe it's life plus anxiety or something like that, or a lack of connectedness, a lack of understanding of my own value.
Yeah, it does. I think the rudderless thing is a nice image, because it's sort of like the difference between sailing on calm waters versus winds and storms and things kicking up when you're...
Maybe it's like doing someone else's job. Like if you go and get a temp position someplace and you do really well and it's really fun, and then you're going to leave because it's just a temp position, then like you might a year later forget that you ever did that. And the whole time you were there, there's a sense of it kind of maybe not mattering. And when I'm doing practice regularly, the rest of life seems to be organized in a way around practice. And when I drop practice, the rest of life continues to do what it's doing, but it's like it's someone else's job. Maybe.
Interesting.
I'm trying to parse something that I've never put into words before. So, and I don't, and trying to do it without sounding like, yeah, man, it just calms me down and I feel more focused. Because it's harder. It's way harder to live life doing practice than not doing practice. Don't do yoga. Don't quit Thelema. Stop listening to us. Don't do yoga. It's not for you.
It's funny because I've always felt like, people who just are going through their lives and just living their lives without seeming to run into too much difficulty. They're just able to have a house, have a family, have their job, have their things that they own and all that sort of thing, and go to baseball games and all that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, keep it up. That's easy. That's just go with it. But
yeah, we don't need you. You don't need us. We don't need you. These practices, asana and pranayama, are to a certain extent mechanical, and to that extent it is just possible for a man of extraordinary willpower with plenty of leisure and no encumbrances to do a good deal of spade work of yoga, even in England. But I should advise him to stick very strictly to the purely physical preparation, and on no account attempt the practices of concentration proper until he is able to acquire suitable surroundings. Why? Why can't I do yoga in England? I do not know. I have some guesses. Why do you?
And this is because everywhere else it feels to me like Crowley's trying to promote the idea that even in a city you can be doing these practices and you can be working towards your union of with the HGAA and all that sort of thing. So it feels to me like this is suddenly acknowledging the fact that if you're trying to live in a country with general normal distractions, then it's going to put a limitation on your progress in this work with yoga. So I don't have and this is a good question.
I think that's exactly right. If you read John St. John, it puts you to shame with his regularity with his yoga work. Mm-hmm. And his ability to read while keeping his mantra going internally and then complaining that he can't do creative writing and still keep his mantra going internally. Mm-hmm. It seems like an astounding feat. But then someone else posted some quote on some maybe Facebook forum or something that I was following. He said, you misunderstand my history totally. I was never able to take up a yoga practice after my last visit to India. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep regularity. The samadhi I experience is more of a consequence of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. So even though in John St. John it seems like he's doing a lot of yoga, he says that after his last visit to India, he was sort of spiritually obligated to give it up entirely. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get a coherent yoga practice together. Maybe it's just because he wasn't living with Alan Bennett in an ashram where yama and niyama were taken care of for him by a guru, and he could just get up in the morning and sit down and practice. You see him trying to recreate this relationship later in Victor Newberg's diary, where Crowley rockets Newberg through his entire AA probation in 8 days because he's coming up to the end of his year and he hasn't fucking done anything. So Crowley says, come to Boleskine, I'll cook for you, I'll give you a room, you can just focus on practice. And then Newberg just whines about it for the entire time. He's mean. The room is too cold. But yeah, I think this is just the pace of life, and the extraordinary discipline required to even do the amount of work that you're doing to expand that practice to include the mental stuff. Maybe he thinks, it's too much. I don't know why he says not even to try. It seems to me like you could easily try. But
we could compare it to the Abramelin ritual, where by the prescriptions of that, we're supposed to go for 9 months or what have you, to a remote place where we have nothing but one child to basically be our servant, helping us out with
well, I think it's that
like
you gradually remove yourself over the course of the 9 months. There are things you're not supposed to do, like you're not supposed to have any congress with the opposite sex. You're not supposed to, like, unless you're married. And even then there are guidelines around it. And if you're a householder and you have to work, you're allowed to keep doing certain kinds of work, but continue withdrawing. And then for the last, it's at least a week, because you need to be in isolation for the KNC proper, for the convocation of the Holy Spirits, and then for the convocation of the evil spirits, which is 7 days. But there may even be 3 days before that when you need to be in isolation too for something else. The HGA working is more kind of forgiving that way, because it's magic and you are going outside of yourself looking for something else. But this that is totally internal and about removing activity. Maybe you can't remove your activity in England. Maybe it just stinks.
Well, I mean, maybe
it's the dirtiest city in the world at the worst time in its history, and it just fucking stinks.
Well, he says even like if you, at the very least, go out into the countryside and all that sort of thing. But it's like, I mean, I guess maybe it's just the fact that you can't go months at a time without some kind of interaction with other people. And if they're not already in agreement with what you're trying to do, they're just, ordinary people. They're not people who are familiar with, the fact that you're trying to do this thing where you're settling out your mind, and they're not respectful towards that or even understanding of it. Then you're inevitably going to run into some kind of jostling against other people and stuff that's probably going to be just feeding the negative tendencies and whatnot.
I guess so. I mean, this is part of the reason to do Resh and the greeting and the will before meals and stuff like this. The moral lessons that Crowley says it teaches are about detachment from concern about how you're seen by others. If you can say it loudly in a public square and have everybody go, then there's some kind of healthy self-expression happening there that's meant to remove that kind of worry about people judging your lifestyle. But maybe it can't be.
Well, I mean, it may not even be something like that, because
Yeah.
it might even just be a matter of like you have to purchase bread, and the person behind the counter tries to charge you like more than they did last time, not recognizing you as been there before, and you're like, wait, that's suspicious. They're this is like, okay, clearly he's trying to fleece me, and you mention it to them, and they're like, oh no, it's okay, and then you've got that going in your head, and that affects, what I mean, little things like that.
Yeah, subtle little. Every little social interaction is an action, and we're trying to remove actions. I don't know why you shouldn't even try. I apologize. I know England is not London. London is the dirtiest city in the world at the worst time in its history. Not now, but
England is the biggest city in the world.
Yeah, England is a larger region than that, and I'm sure has many nice places. I don't want to do the mantra section because I feel like mantra is dealt with better in other places, and I think that people should read this for themselves. I don't need to be comprehensive about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
It's one paragraph.
Although I will say that he suggests mantra as being introduced. You can introduce that during pranayama, and personally, I've been finding that it's really effective for asana. And I don't know if I could do it with pranayama. I haven't really completely given it a go, but like trying to keep track of the timing while simultaneously doing a mantra seems a little bit tricky to me.
So someone once told me to time my breaths with my heartbeat instead of a stopwatch. I still would prefer a stopwatch, but that's possible. And as your system settles, your heartbeat slows down, but it slows down in proportion to how comfortable the breathing is. So eventually you get to a place where it is maybe pretty regular. And then instead of counting, let's say to 6 in, 3 held, 3 in, 3 held, 6 out or something, you could use the 6-syllable mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, so that you are using the mantra to time the movements of the breath. The way he says to do mantra, though, is really idiosyncratic, and I do not think, while it may be a pranayama, I do not think it's compatible with this pranayama. But again, we can deal with that some other time.
Fair enough. And we've been going for quite a bit of time, so it seems like a reasonable place to...
Yeah, I didn't think this was going to be very long because the subject matter in the text is so simple, but I was having so much fun talking to you that we just kept...
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really what I think is going to come out of these. And it seems like every time you're always sort of like, I don't know how much we're actually going to get out of this, but...
No, usually what happens is I go, this text is very stressful and I don't know what it's about. Can we please stop? And this time I thought, I'll be able to deal with this in 25 minutes.
And I think this is the longest one yet.
Yeah, well,
quite possibly.
We know, when you know some things about a subject, I guess it's easier to approach.
Yeah, and I think it is nice that we can bring personal experience to the table rather than just relying entirely on the text in this case as well. So that's kind of nice.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.
93.
93. Love is the law, love unto will. Thanks for listening. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.